Yeah, Ellen White's corpus is vast, tens of thousands of pages, hundreds of thousands, millions and millions of words. So to try and say that there was one theme above all that was most important to her may seem a little controversial, but actually there was, and it was mission. But in addition to her general concern for mission, that is outreach, that she wanted every church member to witness to Jesus. But she had a particular passion within that, which was for foreign mission, overseas mission, what we might today call cross-cultural mission. That was the thing that concerned her above all. She comes back to it repeatedly. Yes, she writes about education, health, temperance, publishing, but these are all just methodologies. They're means to an end, and the end is that we lift Jesus up before the world, and indeed the end is the end of the world and the second coming of Jesus Christ. So this is her great passion. We often forget that as well as traveling incessantly around the United States, she spent 2 years in Europe and 9 years in Australia. She was herself a long-term missionary. And that experience did shape her life and her attitudes, but this was always her great concern, and she was constantly aware that for the gospel really to go all around the world, people living in Christian areas had to take responsibility. And so her concern was that Adventists would put more and more effort into reaching what she doesn't use the term, but we would say unreached people groups, people of other world religions. And she actually says success in home mission depends on the reflex effect of foreign mission. So if we want to be successful in our homelands, we have to be reaching out to those people in the parts of the world who otherwise will never hear about Jesus Christ. Mission was so important to Ellen White, I think partly because of her great love for Jesus Christ and her desire that people hear that good news. But also she has an apocalyptic understanding. A text that she keeps coming back to again and again is Matthew 24, which says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then the end shall come." So not until then, in other words, which means church members, by our action or our inaction, have the capacity to hasten or to delay the second coming of Christ. So understanding that, and also in the context of Revelation 14, her attitude is, we have a duty. The second coming is not going to take place until the gospel of the kingdom has been preached in all the world. So it doesn't matter if we penetrate America or Australia or Europe, or indeed today we might say Brazil and the Philippines, which are the new sort of Christian strongholds. If we penetrate them more and more and more, and there's still billions of people in the 1040 window or in the great cities of Europe where people are now effectively godless, the second coming isn't going to take place. So we have to be reaching out to all the world. So she has this profound apocalyptic and soteriological understanding that says mission is essential, and from that she says, indeed, it's the responsibility of every church member. She will preach in sermons and say, every Seventh-day Adventist must ask himself and herself, how am I going to help take the gospel, preach the gospel of this kingdom in all the world as a witness for all nations? How am I going to do it? Of course, the ways of providence are impossible for us to discern. Was it God's plan for Ellen White to go to Australia, or did he just capitalize on it? I mean, how do we know? I'd certainly believe that providence is in control, but only at a macro level. We know from the history of Israel, God's people have a wonderful capacity to defy his will and really to mess things up. There's no question but the church leaders were quite pleased for Ellen White to go to Australia. It wasn't that they doubted her as a prophet, and in the 9 years she's there, whenever she writes to them, you read the minutes of General Conference sessions and annual councils. They read a letter from Ellen White, and people, this is huge. So it's not that they doubt that she's a prophet, but a living prophet is rather more comfortable when she's several thousand miles away and it takes several weeks for a letter to reach you. And what prompted them asking her to go was the fact that she had received wisdom from God that she had to address the issue of race. the fact that the church in America and indeed elsewhere was racist, and she began to rebuke church leaders for this, and that was what made it too much. So I suspect that it may not have been God's plan for her to go to Australia, and that if church leaders had been more willing to listen and had we had less prejudiced and bigoted attitudes, she may have stayed there. But who's to say? Because certainly God makes the most of that. And it's very important in Ellen White's own life. The experience of living in a different culture long term, I think, shapes her in very profound and important ways. And it gives the sense of importance that she had about mission an even greater impetus. What she does when she's in Australia is she begins to write more and more about the need for mission to go to non-Christians. Now, in the 1890s, Adventists essentially saw themselves as a revival movement within Protestantism. Adventism was taking the truth to Protestants. Pagans, animists, Muslims, forget it. Even Catholics were sort of like, well, we'll do a little bit. But, all of these people just weren't on the radar. In the 1890s, it's when she's in Australia that Ellen White begins to write more and more and more and say, we have to go to China, we have to go to India, we have to go to Japan, we have to go to Ethiopia, we have to go to, as she says, the islands of the sea. In other words, the places where it's not just that they're not Protestants, they're not even Christians. And she is now pushing strongly, saying, we have to do mission to these people who otherwise will never hear the gospel. And I think that comes maybe partly because she herself has been thrown out of her homeland. Maybe it's because in Australia she's closer to Asia, she's closer to China and India. But whatever the reasons, it's while she's in Australia. In her 60s, when we often think people become more conservative, she actually became more radical, and there was a particular impetus for mission. So was it God's plan? Was it because of the hard hearts of church leaders? We don't know, but certainly God used it, and it made a huge difference in Ellen White's life and in the life of our church. Ellen White's writings about mission were extremely important in our history because largely due to her, we made the transition from being a church that said we only need to reach North America. This is what we said in the 1860s and early 1870s. There are immigrants from many parts of the world in America, so to fulfill prophetic prophecies of preaching to all nations, we only need to preach to immigrants in North America. It's extraordinary when you think about it. But that was what Adventists said. So it's not that we hadn't thought about foreign mission. We'd thought about it and said, no, we don't need to do that. Ellen White helps change that. And then she helps change us again from being a church that's only focused on reaching Protestants to saying we have to reach truly people of all religions. So she makes a huge impact historically. But that's not all, because her writings still have relevance today. Because the truth is, China, India, these are still massive challenges to Christianity. We praise God for what we believe to be hundreds of thousands of Adventists in China and millions of other Christians. There's likewise hundreds of thousands of Adventists in India, but we're talking about as a percentage of 1 billion people in each of those countries, it's still a tiny, tiny percentage. And of course, when it comes to the Islamic world, we've been in the Middle East for over a century, and all we have to show for it are churches that are mostly empty. So the concern Ellen White identified in the 1890s and early 1900s in particular is still with us. All her counsel still applies to us. And the way that she saw for us to work, for example, she says we have to use young people. And she actually writes and says, of course, people will say, can we trust our young people to be leaders in missions work? She says, yes, you can. You have to train them. You have to give them appropriate education, but then give them the freedom to experiment. Make them the leaders, not just the foot soldiers. Make them the commanders and the captains. There's a radical testimony that was applicable then, and we still haven't completely followed through on today, so it's still applicable. And finally, there is her concept. She writes in one of her most moving passages, she says, we must take the good news of a Savior who loves people to everyone. And then she says it is their right. And I think very often we don't think it through, but if we do, we sort of assume it's their privilege. But she says it's not. it's their right. And it's our obligation to tell them, because if we don't, nobody will.